Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Sailing into Oblivion podcast. I'm your host, Jerome Rand. Thank you for clicking on this video. It's a very special show in that I'm finally sitting down with someone else who has done the route around the world through the Southern Ocean and around places like Cape Horn, the Cape of Good Hope, the doldrums. I have none other than Golden Globe 2022 winner, Kirsten Neuschafer. And it was fantastic to sit down with her and just talk. I didn't want to have her just tell the story of her trip because I know she's done that a million times before. I really just wanted to get into some aspects of her boat, some of the pinnacle points in that voyage, and then also get into sort of how you keep going when the odds are very much against you or the world is kind of pushing you down and trying to keep your spirits high. So hopefully you enjoy both her take and mine. You know, this is just a conversation between two solo sailors, and it was really, really great to sit down with her. And I cannot wait to do it again because I feel like we could have talked for hours and hours. So hopefully you will enjoy this conversation on this podcast. Before we start the show, like I always say, if you want to help support this channel, this podcast, please consider checking out the links in the description for everything from Patreon to one-time donations, Amazon wish list, all the books, the children's books, the merch, all that sort of stuff helps continue the podcast, but also continued making content for YouTube, especially with the educational and experience oriented content that I'm trying to put out. I'm going to be back on the ocean here shortly and hopefully making some more of that sort of stuff. And hopefully you all enjoy that very much. You can also check out sailingintooblivion.com for any information on my public speaking and events, things like that, where, if you're looking for something to entice people to come to your event, maybe a nice salty sea story is in order. Or if you're looking for a little kick in the pants for your corporate entity, we do that as well. A lot of lessons learned out on the high seas, to say the least. But you can check that out. And then also the coaching and consulting, you can email directly through there. But without further ado, please enjoy my podcast with Kirsten. There we go. Kirsten, welcome to the Sailing into Oblivion podcast, all the way from, are you in Cape Town or Joburg?
I'm actually in the Eastern Cape, not far from East London, so on the Indian Ocean side.
Oh, wow. Okay. Gotcha. Yeah. Well, thank you. It's the afternoon for you. It's the morning for me, but it doesn't matter because we're going to talk sailing today. I'm really excited to have you on the show.
Cool. Well, thanks for having me on the show, Jerome.
No, absolutely. I guess for any of the listeners that might not know, obviously you were not only a participant in the 2022 Golden Globe, but you took home the first place trophy. Congratulations on that, first and foremost. But you were on a Cape George 36, correct?
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
Okay. And had you prepared everything up in Maine in the U.S.?
Actually, that had been my idea, but I couldn't get back into Maine because that was at a time when COVID was at its worst. So because I bought the boat in Canada and Newfoundland, I actually landed up staying in Canada. So I sailed over to Prince Edward Island, and that's where the refit pretty much happened.
Oh, okay. Because the first time I think we ever came across you, like, I think you were looking for sponsorships. We came across like an ad. I was working in a boatyard up in Rockland, Maine, and one of my buddies, Murph, he was like, "Hey, check this out. This lady's gonna go and sail, try and go around the world, da da da." And I was like, "Oh man," because it was kind of leading up to that race, and
that was very much the idea. I was actually working at Maine in Thomaston at the time, and I was working on another boat trying to find a way into Canada to get to my own boat. So, yeah.
What were you doing in Thomaston?
Well, initially I sailed up on Pelagic, which is the 54-foot steel boat that I used to work on down in Antarctica and around Falkland Island, South Georgia. So we sailed that boat up from the Falklands up to Maine, and then the idea was to go to Greenland, but that didn't happen again because of the pandemic. So we just took the
Yeah.
boat out and did a massive refit on it there.
Oh, okay. And how long had you worked down there? Because that's like the Skip Novak setup down there in in the Tierra del Fuego, Cape Horn, Falklands, all
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, I did that for about 5 years. I'd started in about 2014, 2015 on that job.
Oh
So,
wow.
yeah,
Talk
right
about a
up
good
until.
place to it's a good spot to cut your teeth in heavy weather sailing.
Yeah,
Jeez.
definitely. Yeah, that was definitely good training ground for the Golden Globe race. Not that I knew it at the time, but it worked out pretty well. So,
Well, I think, I'd done like a live stream, I think the day that you were rounding Cape Horn. And I think I had posted something about like, welcome Kirsten to the club as a Cape Horner and stuff. And some people were like, oh no, she's been around the horn a whole bunch of times. And I was like, well, there's a big difference between rounding the horn, just down doing sales there as far as going from not only ocean to ocean but around the entire planet and going around that cape.
yeah, definitely. Because the previous times I'd been around the Horn, it'd been like sightseeing tours. We even dropped anchor there once and went ashore. But then obviously you could check your weather ahead of time. Or the other times I passed the Horn would have been going from Puerto Williams in Chile down to the Antarctic Peninsula. But again, then it wasn't really rounding. And I was just reading the other day that a true rounding says you have to have done a passage of a minimum of 3,000 nautical miles from 50 degrees south in the one ocean to 50 degrees south in the other ocean. So that was my first real rounding on the race.
Yeah. Oh man. Well, and knowing that you had spent so much time down there, I mean, when I approached Cape Horn, it was basically a total mystery to me. I'd never sailed in those waters. The chart that I had was decently detailed, but I didn't have any like electronic charts or anything. So
Okay.
I guess I didn't have any sort of bailout plan. Knowing the waters down there, did that kind of ease a little bit of the tension, I guess, knowing that if things really got bad, you might be able to sort of have an exit strategy?
I guess I would have known where to potentially go, where the bays are that I could have sought shelter if I'd needed to, but I didn't really think too much of exiting. I guess my exit strategy, unless the boat was severely damaged, my strategy would always to try and get offshore as quickly as possible, rather than go into all those labyrinths of islands over there.
Oh,
But I must say, having been around there did really help because when I saw the Horn, I knew it was the Horn because I know there are a lot of false
yeah.
capes down there as well.
Right. I was able to sight Diego Ramirez. I
Mm.
don't know how many miles off, but just could barely see it. But actually, when I passed the Horn, it was almost precisely midnight, and by the time the sun came up, it was already over the horizon. So I never actually got to see that pinnacle rock.
All right. Yeah, that's a bit of a pity. Sorry, I've got barking dogs here now all of a sudden. Um,
No
yeah,
worries.
yeah. So it did help to actually see the Horn because, of course, I also my strategy was also to look for Diego Ramirez because we didn't have a GPS. So I thought if I can get a visual on Diego Ramirez, I can alter course directly for the Horn without risking sighting some piece of land that's the false cape, for example. So yeah.
Right. Oh yeah, I get. I often forget that you guys didn't have any sort of modern tech at all. You couldn't even have like a GPS or not GPS, but a Latin long. Because I always had that coming out of my AIS, so I knew, where I was. I was basically always plotting things on a chart, and I would use the
Mm-hmm.
sextant in the mid latitudes, but
Okay.
yeah, to do that with, because it was so cloudy down there in the Southern Ocean.
Mm.
I mean, what was the average, would you say? Because obviously you couldn't take a sunset every day, but I mean, sometimes it seemed like weeks would go by without really seeing the sun.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, that did happen every now and again. Sometimes 3, 4 days. And fortunately, most of the time when that happened to me, it was in the middle of nowhere. So it didn't really matter if I was out on my dead reckoning. And even if I had 60 or even 100 miles of error, it wouldn't have been a big deal. But twice, actually, we were forced to pass unlit, uninhabited islands, leaving them to our starboard. And that was quite
Yeah.
difficult because that was Snares Island and Bounty Island, because both times it was foggy. So Snares, I just managed to catch a little glimpse of it, and Bounty I didn't even see. So I, according to my calculations, I wasn't more than 30 miles away from Bounty,
Oh,
and it
really?
was just
I could,
dense fog.
I think I got within about 8 miles of the Bounty Islands, and it's fine. I mean, they're white. They look like they're covered in snow. They're obviously covered in bird shit, but it was cool. I didn't have a detailed chart of it, and I would have loved to have gotten a lot closer. But the snares, I got hit with easterlies as I was just passing in between North and South Trap and the snares, and
Okay.
I thought, well, shoot, I'm not making any headway into my West Sail 32. So I actually peeled off and went and cruised back and forth around in between the two kind of main islands, and
Mm-hmm.
all the life, the birds, the kelp beds,
Wow.
like it was absolutely amazing. That was a place that I really actually had thought would be cool to see when I was
Yeah.
planning the
Wow.
trip, years before.
Oh wow, that sounds very cool. Yeah, I'm kind of sad I didn't catch a glimpse. I guess if they were as covered in bird shit, I might have caught a smell of them if I was getting too close.
Isn't it amazing though how, especially down there, I find if you do get downwind, even it seems like 100 or more miles from one of those bird islands, you can
Mm.
smell it really
Yeah.
distinctly.
Yeah, it's true. One can really smell it. And even if you can't smell the birds or something that's very much land, I find you can sometimes smell the kelp because it's been smashed off the rocks or whatever. So it's
Oh
still a
yeah.
marine smell, but you know that it's linked to the proximity to land.
It's true. It's true because it is. I mean, it's such a sterile environment when you're,
Mm,
way offshore and everything's
yeah.
kind of just clean, and yeah, it's kind of vacant of these senses that we're used to. I mean, I when I head back towards like the East Coast, the minute I have a westerly breeze, I can
Mhm.
smell, the traffic. I can usually smell like, I don't know, it smells like garbage dumps. Maybe that's just because it's just land on the East Coast, but it's pretty amazing how far out that reaches, how attuned you get
Mm.
to it.
It's true. Well, actually, when we were passing the photo gate on the race off Cape Town, I think there must have been a sewage leak or something because it smelled really bad. It was one of those where you're kind of happy to get away again, just back to the clean ocean air. So,
Yeah, right. It's kind of like, oh man. Well, and kind of speaking on that, obviously I went out in 2017. I actually my plan initially was to set sail from the East Coast in 2018, and then Don sets up this race, and I'm kind of like, man, I don't want to just be out there while this race is going on. So I bumped
mhm,
up a year, and I took off, and I didn't really tell people I was doing it. It was just my own
mhm.
sort of personal adventure. You had a completely different situation where you're essentially on the world stage. I mean, what is that like to just have the constant barrage of people, questions, interviews, all this sort of stuff while you are trying to get this boat ready for this absolutely epic challenge ahead?
Yeah, for me it was a whole new world, Jerome, because I'm actually a very private person and I like my anonymity. So I'd never been on any sort of social media platform or anything like that before I signed up for the race. And then, of course, it became compulsory. We had to go onto Facebook, and I would have had to anyway to try and market myself and try and get funding for the race. So it was a huge, huge shift for me to suddenly, you know, make public certain aspects of my life, especially like you say, in the middle of preparing. And
Yeah.
I'd already lost sort of 6 months to COVID, so I was working under a lot of time pressure, and then the race also had its rules in terms of you've got to submit like a selfie interview and selfie photograph footage,
Oh
and I'm just
God.
thinking, what? This has nothing to do with anything about getting a boat and yourself ready for a race. So, but then the nice part about it was that it was a nice way to share with people that were genuinely following with interest, or people that had been supporting me, because we set up a GoFundMe, for example, just to try and raise funds. And a lot of people really helped me through that. And I don't know if they would have known about me if I hadn't sort of forced myself onto the stage, so to say. So, yeah.
Right, right. Well, and I think I had heard you on either another podcast or maybe it was just one of the YouTube videos, and you kind of were talking about how Don's got a very difficult challenge of like, how do you present this to the public, a
Mm,
race which takes part in, these far off places that you can't just bring people aboard, you can't film it from, in real time. And
mm,
yeah, I guess sort of that lead up time is really the excitement to try and build up the stuff, because I mean, I think one of the big things when you take on that challenge like you did, you become kind of an ambassador for the sport of offshore sailing. And so that effort, I think, really helps to really promote it and get more people excited and involved in the sport in
mm.
itself.
Yeah, you're right. And, after all, we need the spectators, because if there was no one interested in watching an event like this, the event wouldn't happen. So it is a nice way to share. But it is, I mean, I don't know, how was it for you? Because I know you left on your own in relative anonymity, but people knew about you because people were telling, when I signed up for the race, the first thing they said is, oh, Jerome, he's done it. He's gone around the world. He stopped in the Falklands, but he's done it. And I'm like, wow, that's cool. So I mean, obviously, people started to discover you whether you wanted it or not.
Yeah, I mean there definitely was a bit of a following. I think my mom, she was actually posting my daily sort of position reports on Facebook. That was pretty
Mm-hmm.
much the extent of the sharing of it, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, coming back in still, it was a small crowd. Gloucester as a seaport wasn't all that interested in some solo sailor coming in. So the crowds were pretty minimal, but it was all friends and family and stuff. And
Oh
so
yeah.
it didn't really matter to me. But again, for my trip, I think the real purpose was I don't know, it was just like this personal goal and this personal adventure that I wanted to go on. And I think in some ways that helped, because not having the public eye on me, I don't know, I think it just alleviated some of the pressure that I would have felt. I mean, I had to deal with enough anxiety and worry and
Mm,
fear, whether or not I had people watching or not. Because setting off from the East Coast, I still have to cross all the hurricane belts and all that sort of stuff, because I
yeah.
left October 3rd, which was
Oh wow.
late. But when you leave from the East Coast, if you leave in September, you're almost guaranteed going to be ducking and dodging those big storms. And
Mm.
when do you guys set out from Le Sable de Long?
So we left on the 4th of September, and I think the next edition's leaving at a similar sort of date, which on that side of the
Okay.
coast is all right.
Yeah.
Um, like maybe a couple of weeks earlier, then there'd be less chance of, the big storms moving into the Bay of Biscay, because when we left, there was initially quite a big storm forecast to be coming in on the day that we were meant to leave. And then fortunately the forecast changed. So it wasn't, 40 knots of headwinds for the start.
Oh,
But we already had to navigate our way around a few little systems. They were smallish systems, but it was okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely leaving from that far north in the North Atlantic is always a bit of a roll of the dice as far as the low pressure systems. I mean, when in 2022, I left Maine in mid-November, and I was just trying to do a figure eight between the North and South Atlantic, like 4 or 5 month long trip, mostly in the trade winds. And on November 25th, I got turned upside down by a rogue wave just past the Gulf Stream, about 400 or so miles northwest of Bermuda. So that would have been about the time you were in maybe the Indian Ocean, I would think. I was having my own trials and tribulations in the Atlantic.
Wow, yeah. And I mean, that's the problem with the Gulf Stream as well, is if they're going to be rogue waves and bad weather and bad sea state, then that's exactly where you're going to find it. Fortunately, we're leaving out of Europe. We don't have the Gulf Stream, leaving off the east coast of the US. But yeah, wow. So
Well,
did you do a 360?
No. I basically, from what I can ascertain, because I was down below, thankfully, but from the damage that was done to the boat and where it occurred and what it felt like, to be down below, I think the wave crested and broke perfectly underneath the boat, and we just rolled pretty much upside down and then went over the falls like a surfer. And when we hit the trough, that's when the gallows and the Dodger and all that sort of stuff got ripped right off the boat. But there was a lot of damage to the ceiling in the cabin from objects, getting thrown up and everything. But yeah, I mean, the Gulf Stream. But in the same respect, and I definitely wanted to ask you about this, obviously there's always going to be a little bit of debate on having to deal with going through those gates. But the one gate in the Golden Globe that I think worried me the most was always having to pull into Cape Town, because that kind of sets you up to have to really take on the Agulhas Current directly. I passed hundreds of miles south of Cape Town because I wanted to avoid as much of it as possible, but you have to go kind of right into it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Jerome, that would be the sensible thing to do, is stay south of it, because Cape Town's on about 34 degrees south, and that pulls you right into the Agulhas. And not only that, if you're passing there in the southern summer, the prevailing southeasterlies, and sometimes they're 30 to 40 knots strong, and they can blow for 3 or 4 weeks non-stop, the so-called Cape Doctor. So it's really from the current and from the weather, and then there's fishing traffic, and there's lots of shipping traffic, especially now with the Suez Canal problem. Vessels have to pass the Cape of Good Hope, so it makes things a lot trickier, and it adds distance and time onto a race like that, because you're going from the south, further south in the South Atlantic, back up towards Cape Town, and then you have to drop south again. So, I mean, Don actually asked me before the race started, maybe a couple of years before, if there was one thing I could change about the Golden Globe race, what would that be? And I said I'd do away with the Cape Town gate. And then he still laughed, and he said, well, you can want that as much as you want, but the Cape Town gate is happening. So, but I believe it's not happening in the 26th edition. So,
oh, really? Oh.
Yeah.
I wonder if what would you think if they put it on Tristan da Cunha down on that little island?
That could be really interesting. I think it might cost Don and his team a small fortune to get down to Tristan.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, you probably know they also wanted to put Punta del Este in Uruguay in as a photo gate on our race, and then they landed up cancelling it. Somewhere halfway. Yeah, they just decided enough photo gates, let the fleet keep going. But I actually thought a really nice photo gate would be on the Falkland Islands.
I think so too, but I do know I think when I was emailing back and forth with Don about that, he had heard about my experience trying to get in there. So, obviously I needed to get a food supply run out to me. And,
Okay.
again, I don't have any charts. I've never sailed down there before.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was approaching Port Stanley, a pretty severe storm was coming
Mm-hmm.
at the Falklands, from the
Yeah.
west. And, when I think about it now, I was really fortunate. Had I been maybe 12 hours late, I don't think I would have been able to just get in there. I might have actually been blown out to sea, and I was pretty much tapped as far as how much food I had. And, but it, it's one of those things where that challenge of that day was in some ways super overwhelming, terrifying. I would never want to do it, but then it led
Mm-hmm.
to like the best day ever because all of a sudden I had like chocolate chip cookies in my hands and all this sort of stuff. But it was really scary trying to sail through some of those outer rocks and get into that bay, not having any sort of
Mm.
chart or anything. I mean, the Falklands on my chart were the size of like a coin or something like that. And
Okay.
so my friends had described what I should be seeing, but
Mm-hmm.
it was one of those things where thankfully there was a bit of a southerly swell that definitely would have shown where it shallowed up. And I just
Yeah.
followed where there were no breakers or anything like that. But have you spent a lot of time in the Falklands then?
I have actually, back in the days of working on Pelagic, if we were doing charters down to South Georgia, we'd plan everything out of the Falklands. So our crew
Oh,
and
okay.
clients would come into the Falklands. We'd provision the boat in the Falklands. Actually, when I sailed past there on the race, it was kind of fun because I decided that if weather permitting, I'd sail really close past Stanley, and I just
Mm-hmm.
knew if I do, someone's going to come out and wave because
Oh, yeah.
that's actually why I mentioned it as a photo gate because I kind of had my own private little impromptu unplanned photo gate because the weather was good and I landed up sailing, even just poking my nose into Port William really quickly
Yeah.
just before Stanley, and then a launch came out with a whole lot of friends, and they were waving, and it was just fun. So, but I mean, as you say, the weather can get really bad there. So probably if you planned a gate there for a race, half of the
Yeah.
people would be able to go through the gate. So,
Well,
but
is
Gerard,
there
did you stop there, or did you just get reprovisioned and then keep going?
Oh, I just got reprovisioned. So
Okay.
they were when my family got in touch with the government there, that was
Mm-hmm.
one of the things they discussed was whether or not I would have to anchor and
Okay.
do anything clear customs. And they said if he wants to keep going, he doesn't have to do anything. We'll just come out. And they brought the boat right up alongside Sparrow. We didn't tie off or anything, and they just tossed all the boxes and let me just keep drifting. So
Oh wow, that's
technically,
really cool.
I yeah, I was super stoked, and I've always wanted to get down there to
Mhm.
just meet some of the people that were involved in all of that
Yeah.
because it was a pretty, it wasn't a bad day, but the winds were in the high 30s and growing, and there were hail squalls, and these guys came out on that boat, and they, to
Mhm.
them obviously it's just another Tuesday, but for me it was this amazing sort of relief and all that sort of stuff. But it was kind of
Yeah.
funny too when I finally got a really big blown up chart of Port William and Port Stanley. So my boat, the name of it's the Mighty Sparrow, and there is a little bay in there called like Sparrow's Bay or something like that.
Okay. Hmm.
If I would have known it, that would have been where we tried to do our little rendezvous because I had to sail up way up in there before the waves calmed down enough. And the
Okay.
winds were howling out of the west. So I was kind of fighting my way into the wind. And at first, I think I was down to my triple reef main and a storm jib. And
Hmm.
I was making no headway. And I could see these people were just like, all right, this is going to take forever. And so I ended up putting up more sail and trying to get up there a little faster. But
So
yeah, in
you
the
went
end,
quite far into Port William, eh?
I did what? Sorry.
So you had to go quite far up into Port William.
A decent amount, yeah, because the chop, it was just too much for them to be able to pull up along safely and just make it so that we could do the quick transition, because there was a lot of food. I mean, I still had another 2 months or something like that to get to get back to Gloucester, and I screwed up so bad on the provisioning. By then
you were already on strict rations.
Oh yeah, I had been rationing for nearly 3 months at that point. I had lost about 45 pounds, I think, by the time I got there.
Wow.
So it was pretty rough. Yeah.
Wow,
How did as far as like your provisioning and all that sort of stuff, was that something you had to just completely do on your own, or did you have any sort of experts or dietitians or anything like that kind of helping out?
No, I did it all on my own, and I was very unscientific about it. So, for example, if I compare my provisioning to some of the other guys, what they had done is, like Michael Guggenberger, for example, he told me he had a little box for every day, and in that box he had a chocolate and a canned fruit and a meal and a this and a that. So, and he had however many days worth of these little boxes. So he knew exactly what he was eating every day. But for me, I'd done two-month passages before the race. So I'd gotten a good feel of how much I eat and of what things I'm actually going to be eating. And then after that, I just stocked up every time I had transport and a good supermarket nearby. So the first big stock up was in Canada. Then I did another really big stock up in Cape Town because I sailed from Canada to Cape Town. And then I sailed back to Europe, first to the Azores and then France. So I stocked up in the Azores again and again in France. And I had a lot of food. I took a bit of freeze-dried food with. I took a whole lot of just normal stuff like rice and pasta and canned food and biscuits and chocolate and dried fruits. And then my luck was that a French chef gave me 100 little jars of sealed food that he had made, little meals, and I could stretch each jar into 2 meals, and he gave me 100. I gave some of the jars away to the other competitors, but I kept about 70, so that was about 140 meals for me as well.
Oh, nice. So did you end the race with a decent stock still on the boat?
Yeah, I could probably easily have stayed out there for another 8 weeks if I'd had to. I wouldn't have lacked calories, but I would have been lacking some of the things I really liked and enjoyed. So, for example, I was a real idiot about putting enough coffee on board because I ran out of coffee, or at least I realized I was going to run out of coffee quite early. So after that, I was drinking very weak coffee, and that stretched for a while. And I would run out of chocolates and nuts and I don't know, some of the comfort foods that I had. But calorie-wise, I could have kept on going.
Wow. Yeah, I ran out of coffee somewhere in the Pacific, and I was absolutely kicking myself. And I started like toying with whatever spices I had on the boat. So I can remember boiling water and putting like garlic flakes and things like just to have some sort of flavor, because you're out there. Yeah, exactly. I mean, the one thing which definitely couldn't have been healthy, but I had like these little jars of probiotics, and it was some sort of like melon flavor or something like that. And I couldn't help myself. I'd keep like dumping a little more in, like it was some sort of mixed powdered drink. The trillions of probiotics that I was intaking was definitely not a good thing, but you got to do what you got to do.
I guess you do, and I mean, you also have to. Food is quite a comfort out there, So
yeah.
I can't imagine what it must have been like for you already rationing 3 months before you got to the Falklands. That's why I can imagine your joy when you got in there in such rough weather and got out with chocolate chip cookies.
It was like I said, one of the greatest days of my life. Like when I tell the story, I do a lot of public speaking and stuff. When I tell that story, it always gets such a laugh because I mean, somehow as these boxes are coming over to me, I'm opening them, and I've got a log of chocolate chip cookies in one hand, and somehow I had time to make a sandwich and put it in the other hand while I'm taking more boxes on. And it was just this whole frenzy of like joy that I don't think I've ever felt in my whole life. And
Oh wow. Wow. And that's
golly.
really cool that you didn't have to stop. For some reason I thought you might have gone ashore, but that's fantastic that you were able to organize it all so that you could just keep going. That's very cool.
Well, that is all thanks to the Falkland Island government, because they could have easily. I don't know what the rules are as far as, because I was in their waters, and I
Yeah.
was making essentially contact, no physical contact, but
Mhm.
they're giving me goods and all that sort of stuff. But who knows? I don't ask any questions, and we just sort of
I,
move
yeah,
on.
and from my experience of the Falkland Islanders, they are incredibly helpful. I mean, I guess they're so isolated where they live, and some of them are even more isolated because they live on their farms that are cut off from even, Stanley. And my experience
Yeah.
with them is that they're just happy to help. So
No, I think
probably,
so. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, it was probably kind of like fun. It's like, oh, there's this guy passing and he needs food. So,
Well, and I guess the last thing I want to say on the food thing was, and I'm sure you can relate to this, but like when you are, my example, I guess, is a bit extreme because I was running out of food, and you're still sitting on this boat, and you
mm,
see this pile of food, and you're starving, you're so hungry, but
mm,
you've got to make it last, and
yeah.
every time you sort of dip in, you're just stealing from the future self, in a way. But it's quite a challenge, and I think every sailor knows this when they start looking at like things like chocolate or biscuits, the
Mm,
tasty treats, because those are
yeah.
always the first to run out.
Mm.
How were you able to discipline yourself enough, or was it just the normal, like, I'm gonna run out, so I might as well eat them all right now?
I was actually able to be quite disciplined with myself, but that was also because I made it difficult for myself to access some of the food. So I had stowed a lot of my food up in the forepeak, and there were a whole lot of
Yeah.
sales under above those lockers. So my plan was I had my so-called working lockers of food, and I'd put maybe 2 months worth of food in those working lockers, and then I'd make sure I've only got enough rations of chocolates and all the nice things. And then the rest of the stock was piled up forward there, where it was such a mission to get it that after every 2 months, I'd haul the sails out and I'd dig stuff out from deep down below. So that kind of helped me a little bit to just make the access difficult.
Oh, absolutely. Well, when my final, I think somewhere in the Indian Ocean, I had run out, or almost run out. I was down to my last beer, and I took that beer, and I knew that I would want to have that for Cape Horn, and so I actually hid that up in the forepeak and was able to like kind of forget that it was there until I got to Cape Horn. By that time, it had been shaken up for 8,000 miles. So it wasn't all that good, but it was at least really cold. It was about
Uh,
28 degrees when I rounded the horn. So
no, not wow. Okay, that is cold. Yeah, sure.
that
Hmm.
definitely helped. But one of the funny things was that my younger brother, Adam, had hid food like candy and stuff like that kind of all over the boat. And I found all of it, which was nice because it was quite a while before I started discovering it. But when
Mm-hmm.
I was cleaning out the boat after it was hauled out, after the whole thing, and I
Uh-huh.
pulled the propane tanks out of the lazarette,
Mm-hmm.
underneath one of them was a full bag of beef jerky, and
Uh,
I had
and you
and
and you would so have wanted to eat that afterwards.
it would have been a pinnacle moment, to say the least, of joy and happiness, had I
Hmm.
found it out there. It was pretty funny to find it there because I immediately called him and he was like, "Oh yeah, I forgot about that one," and I'm just thinking to myself, "Oh, holy cow!" But um,
Yeah. Hmm.
I have a couple of notes that normally I don't do any sort of notes, but there are a couple things that I wanted to sort of specifically pick your brain on because I do like to sort of investigate and discover and learn from other people some of the secrets to I don't know, I don't want to just say secrets to success or like not giving up and all that sort of stuff, but um just methods or anything that any insight that you might have, you know, into the first thing would be being able to stay positive when you're in, you know, pretty uncertain circumstances. There's dangers, there's discomfort. You know, the ocean often throws just some of the worst conditions at us, as well as some of the best. But how when you are just, it's miserable and life is just terrible out there, how do you kind of work your way through that mentally? And do you have any sort of tricks that you kind of utilize?
Yeah, well, a friend of mine said to me many years ago, because we used to like hiking and going and doing stuff that puts you in uncomfortable positions where you're freezing all night or whatever it is,
Yeah.
hungry, whatever the case may be. And this person said to me, you can survive anything as long as you know that there's going to be an end to it. So
Yeah.
I would often say to myself, if it was getting really uncomfortable for whatever reason, it was damp, it was wet, the motion of the boat was uncomfortable, you're getting thrown around, I'd always say to myself, you can survive it, there will be an end to it. So just grin and bear it. That was the one little thing. Then the other little thing is that it actually ties in a little bit with the food and your beer, for example, that you'd stashed away for a special occasion. Is I always like to set myself little milestones. And once I've reached that milestone, I reward myself with something simple like a chocolate or a beer or a little celebration in my mind, so that I can break up a very long trip into bite-sized steps. Because sometimes when you're thinking of the entirety of the journey, it just seems overwhelming, too much, too long, too far. Can you make it? And then you start overwhelming yourself with these kind of ideas. So breaking things down, and then rewarding yourself when you've reached the milestones. And then I'm sure you do it as well, Jerome, because you're a single-hander, but I talk a lot to myself. I always have, even before I started sailing on my own. And they're kind of like two me's then when I'm talking to myself. The one's like the mopey, moany one that's complaining and this and that. And the other one's the one like, just pull yourself together. Get over yourself. Stop this complaining. You're irritating. You're bad company and you're the only company. So just shut up. I don't want to listen to your moaning. Get on with the job. Do what you have to do. And it might sound harsh or crazy or insane or whatever, but it actually works, because all I'm really doing is I'm forcing my mental state into a better state of positivity by pointing out to myself how useless it is to waste energy being negative.
Wow, no, I 100%. I mean, golly, the amount of times I've basically said exactly what you just said to people. It all rings 100% true. And I think that is a testament to the fact that, you know, sometimes people will be like, well, you know, you're just like a naturally positive person. But in fact, it takes sort of work and practice and actually sitting down and trying to come up with these ways in order to stay positive. It's not like it's just like, oh, Kirsten's just a naturally positive person, so she can just do this. I'm not. No, you actually have to sit there and think and come up with these mental games that you almost play with yourself to be able to get through. And when I headed out, I had a close encounter with Tropical Storm Ophelia. And so I had to head south a lot earlier than I wanted to in the Atlantic. And so when I hit the easterly trades, I was like bashing into them for weeks. And on a west sail, as opposed to the Cape George, the west sail just doesn't want to go into the wind. It hobby horses, and it's got that big rounded bow, so it doesn't cut through it. It just basically recoils on every single wave. And to say it's uncomfortable is like an understatement. But it was one of those things where I find this is sort of the key to being like having that trait of like perseverance, where like you're saying, I would kind of project myself. I knew the doldrums were coming up and that was going to be a big break. And so eventually this bashing into the wind and beating into it was going to come to an end. And then sometimes I would kind of like challenge myself and say, you know, really out loud almost like, am I the type of person that can persevere through these next couple of weeks? Or am I one that's just going to give up? And then you're almost challenging your ego in a way, I suppose. And I think a lot of these different ideas work. Some work with some people, some with others. But it's the idea of having multiple different avenues where, you know, okay, well, today shrinking my focus down isn't really working all that well. I'm still freaking out here. So let's project ourselves to, you know, this area and how we're going to feel if we keep going. I mean, did you ever get into a situation where you seriously thought about abandoning the race?
Well, the one, for me, the most difficult moment in the race by far, mentally, obviously, because physically it wasn't really a challenge, but it was getting stuck in the doldrums on my way back up. Because now I was on my last leg and I got stuck for almost 2 weeks. And I was driving myself crazy and I was getting really negative, saying, there's no way I can win this race anymore. I was in the lead, but I've probably lost the lead and I might be stuck around here for the next months. You know, I was just getting miserable. And then that was the one moment I was getting so fed up with everything. I kind of thought to myself, you know what? I could easily just give it up and like swing a left and go to Brazil, except that I couldn't because there was no wind. So it's like, well, even if you want to give up now, you're stuck, mate. Sorry, you're just going to have to stick it out. And when the wind comes back, you might as well just keep going north, you know? So,
right. Well, and I think that's one of the hardest parts that I have of trying when I talk to like business, like corporate sort of events and stuff. You know, one of the secrets that I try not to let on to too much is the fact that, you know, when you're ocean sailing, you're dealing with these, you know, monstrous challenges, whether it's storms or the route you're taking. You can't just give up. And, you know, for people on land and dealing with those sort of challenges, you can always find a different path. You can quit, you can throw somebody else in front of it. And so they have to really sit down and make the mental choice of like, no, I'm going to keep going on this challenge that I have set out for myself. But we don't have that. We are stuck on the ocean. And even if, you know, in the Pacific, there were a few times where I was like, man, I could just go north and go to Tahiti. That'd be so nice. But it would take me like 2 weeks to get there anyway. And in those 2 weeks, I'm sure I'd reconsider and head back further south. But
well, I mean, it's in that respect, for me, sometimes very interesting what you just said. Sometimes it was more challenging to keep going before I got to the start line, to keep going with the campaign, you know, with things like financial pressures building up and there all these deadlines and am I going to make the start line in time? And I'm sure you had the same when you had made the decision that you wanted to sail solo nonstop around the world. There comes this point where you say to yourself, wow, that's a huge adventure. Like, what am I thinking? What am I doing? Why am I not just like getting up like everyone else in the morning in my house and making myself a cup of coffee and going to an office or something, or, you know, something a little bit more normal, you know, where that's sometimes the bigger challenge to say, no, this is my dream. I do want to keep going.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And really, I think the biggest tool that helped me through any of those doubts and times in the preparation stages and the planning was really just the fact that there was so much to do. And, you know, you had the running list of 100 million things that needed to be checked off before you could dump the boat in the water. And I didn't know it at the time, but now looking back and reflecting on it, I'm kind of like, oh man, every time I started to get worked up, I'd glance over, see the list, and I'd be like, well, let's try and check one or two of these things off tonight. And then tomorrow we'll deal with this. And, you know, I always recommend to people when they're trying to prepare especially for voyages and such. But I suppose for any challenge that you take on in life, when you have that physical list and you really detail it down, it gives you this sort of advantage of being able to pick and choose what you want to do, but you can also match it up with your mental sort of state at that moment, where if you're feeling super motivated, you're like, let's tackle the big one. And if you're like, man, I don't want to do a single thing but go watch Netflix right now, you just go and fix the easiest, tiniest things on that list. And I don't know, I've always found that those sort of help out a little bit.
It's true. Lists are really, really important. And I'm the same. I'll always put a few fun jobs on, like, I don't know, you want to paint something so it looks good, but it's got no practical value. So it's on the job list. It's just not high on the list of priorities. But on a day when you'd rather just be watching Netflix and you did this little paint job and now it looks pretty, it's still motivating in some other way.
Yeah, right. No, it totally is. Not to switch back real quick, but the doldrums. I have always been absolutely fascinated by that place. Like I think I've crossed the doldrums, I don't know, I easily maybe 10 times at this point in my life. But I do remember in one interview you had talked about how most of the guidebooks say that the further west you are, the narrower the band is. And that's what I was going off of out of some old cruising book that I had, because I tried to do the exact same thing where I think it was 9 or 10 days to cross going south when I was closer to Africa. And I was like, oh man, this next one, it's going to be a breeze because I'm headed towards the Caribbean anyway. And I'm just going to go further over. And I think it was even longer to get across the doldrums my second time. And I was already pretty rattled from just being out on the ocean for 30 days at that point.
Wow. Yeah.
Were you in that same situation?
When you want to get stuck anymore.
I know.
It's mind galloping back to the stable and you come to a dead halt. So, I mean, this is the thing. You can go by these rules of thumb and you can go on all this historical weather data. Because when I was going through the doldrums, I was going off Ocean Passages for the World edition 1968, when they used to really concentrate on sailing routes. And I was going according to their route, and I got good and properly stuck. And when I was looking at the weather after the race, if I had gotten there even just 10 hours earlier, it was literally like I got there and the band just widened up in front of me. So if I'd gotten there 10 hours earlier, maybe I would have cut my time in the doldrums by half or something. I don't know. But it is. It's interesting though, because I mean, a lot of people, unless you're on a race or you were doing what you were doing, some people would just motor through, or they have the weather information to know how they can get past there, and not being able to use an engine over a long distance and not having weather information really gave me an understanding for the first time what it must have felt like for those tall ships of old. When they got in there and they had no idea, it's like getting into some kind of twilight zone that you might never get out of again. Especially if you're on your last legs and your water's rotting in the barrels and you've got scurvy and I don't know what not. So,
and there's sharks constantly circling around, and you don't have any sunscreen, so everybody's just turning blackened from the sun. I couldn't even imagine like some of the horror stories, but it's kind of funny because the first time I crossed the South Atlantic was back in like 2004, and there was a company that used to run all the deliveries of the catamarans that were being built for the charter companies in the Caribbean. And so I flew down there to do one as a mile builder. It was pretty early in my sailing career, and we reached the doldrums and we turned the engines on and we flew right through it. And I can only remember one or two things from that whole stretch because we just blasted right through it. Now, flash forward to every other time I've been aboard Sparrow and I'm just trying to sail through. I'm never using the engine for propulsion, all that sort of stuff. And I have some of the most beautiful, scary, terrifying, wonderful memories from that place. because it's always struck me as this world of serene beauty when it's just totally calm. And in some of your videos, I mean, you saw it really, really calm, where it's like a mirror, and you still get those beautiful towering clouds. And at night, when the stars are reflecting off the ocean, and you can't see where the sky stops and the ocean begins, and like there's just this beauty, but then it gets interrupted when you get slammed by a 50-knot squall and lightning everywhere, and it's wild. I mean, for some reason, I've always been enamored by that place. I love it.
Yeah, I mean, it is a really fascinating place, like you say, because it's such a place of contrast. There's this incredible serenity and beauty, and I've seen some of the most amazing rainbows, for example, just after a squall or lighting up a squall. And then it can get so incredibly violent so quickly with all that lightning, especially. So it is a fascinating place, and in some senses, I think I might not have disliked it as much as I did if I hadn't been in a race, because it would have been much easier for me to make peace with the fact that I was stuck. But for me, it was really awful, because I'd known that I was in the lead when I came around the horn, and then I'm like, oh no, it's like trying to hold on to a handful of sand, and with every moment I'm losing, the little granules of sand are slipping through my fingers. So that's what really put the damper on it. But I agree, it is a really, really fascinating place.
Yeah, it definitely is. Well, and it was so interesting to see the clips from when those birds got blown offshore in that storm and landed on your boat, because one of the nights on my trip around, I got hit by just an absolute wall of a squall. I think it was like a tropical wave that had started. Essentially, though, the next morning I came up on deck and there was an owl that was on my boom, and it was eating a little tiny blackbird. And I couldn't believe what I was even seeing. And I took little video clips, and people were like, sure enough, they're like, that's an owl, man. And I don't know, I was 500 miles off the coast. He flew away. I'm assuming he either came from the land in that storm, or maybe lived on one of these container ships or something like that, and just flew over to Sparrow one morning. But yeah, you had tons of them landing on your boat, right?
Yeah, and also different species of them. And it's interesting that this owl was busy chowing another bird, because there were definitely sort of carnivorous birds looking at cannibalizing one of or two of the little weaker small ones.
Oh, wow, yeah. Well, dog eat dog world out there,
Sure is.
Okay, let me look, because I know we're getting close on our time here, but I just want to make sure I got all these. Oh yeah, okay. So obviously one of the huge moments in your trip was the rescue of Tapio. I'm sure you must be familiar with like Pete Goss and his story from the 97 Vendée Globe, where he rescued Denelli off of basically his boat. I mean, well done. First and foremost, you're able to find him in this teeny little life raft. But how did that feel to be the hero, to come and save the day there? I mean, really, it truly is. It's a remarkable thing.
Well, thanks, Jerome. I guess I never felt like I was the hero in that story. I felt Tapio was the hero of his own story there, because he managed to react the way he did to get himself safely off his boat that went down in, I think, about 30 minutes, which is really not a lot. It might sound like a lot, but by the time you've actually even grasped that there's no way that you can stem the flood or rescue your vessel, and he even only managed to grab one of his grab bags. And then on top of it, he said that when he deployed the life raft and it inflated and it was drifting, and he was like, "Whew, okay, the thing's floating." It was floating away because it wasn't quite on. So he had to jump, like it was very instantaneous, spontaneous, last minute survival thinking, jump and get onto the life raft. So for me, it felt like he'd already rescued himself and he was just waiting for a ride ashore. And what I always say is, if I hadn't come, then someone else would have. There was the cargo ship that would have come anyway, irrespective of whether I'd gotten to him beforehand. The only thing
Yeah.
is that it made it much easier for them to get him on board by my first having taken him on board, because of course they would, I'm assuming they might have had to put one of their rescue boats into the water to get to him, because they would never have been able to approach him on a ship.
Right.
So I really just felt like I'd facilitated the rescue, and then it's just because I was closest to him. Otherwise, someone else would have done it. And again, I think any sailor and anyone in general would just do it, So I felt like it's just law of the sea. You go and offer assistance to someone who needs it when you can. So.
Well, I definitely agree with you there, but I do hats off for being able to find him and be in that position. I mean, you could play the what if game of like, well, what if it was blowing force 10 at the time and you had to beat back up into the wind or this, that, or the other thing. And all circumstances made it I wouldn't say easy for that, but it looked like a pretty smooth operation.
Yeah.
But still, it is it must feel pretty darn cool to be like, yeah, I rescued a guy out in the Indian Ocean, no big deal.
Well, I guess what was really cool about the experience is getting to him and speaking to him, because I was thinking the whole time he's going to be like really
miserable.
down.
Yeah,
And he
yeah.
was so positive and he was joking. So for me, that was a cool lesson in positivity.
Well, and you had mentioned that in one of the video interviews that you did, and that was pretty surprising because I think I like to think that I'd be pretty stoked that I'm still alive. And truth be told, my biggest nightmare scenario is to actually be in a life raft with, Lord knows what kind of fish underneath me trying to poke at the thing. I mean, have you read Stephen Callahan's book Adrift?
I have, and that is the type of situation I also really have no desire to experience.
God, I mean, so I'm not one of those that likes to swim off of the boat. I have had to scrape barnacles and stuff like that, but I'm not like Knox Johnson, swimming every day that it's okay to do so. And no, thank you. Like I like having a nice thick layer of fiberglass in between me and any of the animals out there in the sea. But to be on an inflatable raft and have things poking at you from the bottom, like I think I would go insane. I don't think I could handle it mentally. So I would have probably been pretty positive when I saw a ship coming. And I guess technically though, you guys kept the life raft tied to your boat so that would make it easy to get him to the ship, correct? How did that all work out?
So initially, when I was speaking to the ship's captain, he suggested that I come alongside, and I'm like, "Whoa, sorry, negative. Can't come alongside." So then we thought about how can we do it, and the plan we came up was if their crew could throw a line really far, then I'd come as close as I safely felt I could, which actually was quite close at the end of the day. So they managed to throw a line from their deck right onto Minnehaha's deck. And then Tapio grabbed that line and he jumped back into his raft with the line. And then I cut his raft free. So they could pull him in his raft to the ladder, the rope ladder. And then he first climbed up. And then they pulled the whole raft up onto the ship as well. So they didn't even have to leave it behind as pollutant to the ocean,
Oh, very cool. Very cool. Yeah, because I mean, I think we were always taught that if you weren't going to take the life raft, you're supposed to like cut it so that it at least sinks, so that people don't see it and think there's somebody in it or something like that. But it's kind of nice because that's a huge amount of like rubber and plastic and all that
so it's kind of nice that they got to take that with. I mean, it would have been a little 4-man life raft at the end of the day. It looked like they were pulling a little balloon up there.
They're really tiny. When I prepped for that trip, I actually purchased my mom, this was one of her contributions to that trip, was a 6-person life raft. Okay. And I really wanted that one after reading Stephen Callahan's book, because he had a 6-person for that purpose, because he was like, man, I got into a 4-person at the store and he couldn't even like lay down. They're so tiny and they're great because they're compact. I mean, I have a 4-person now, but it's it's pretty incredible. But yeah, hopefully never have to use them, never have to have that experience.
Yep, knock on wood. That's
yeah, 100%. One last technical question. I kept seeing, so you would run downwind with double jib, one on either side, and would you pull those out?
Exactly. So I had this Yankee foresail with the 2 wings that were identical. So I could either use it as just one single sail. If I was sailing with, the wind on one side, then I'd just have them lying up against each other, which was fine. They were 4-ounce cloth. But then if I was running dead downwind, so they were on one rope bolt, so that they couldn't open up the foil on the slot on the foil. Yeah. So they were stitched onto one rope bolt, and then I pole one out to either side. And that was very cool because I didn't have a boom then. I dropped the main, so there was no chance of the boom jibing. And you had quite a long sort of range to play in, because you could go over the one side or the other side without having to jibe. And you could furl it. I could furl it from the cockpit, so I could reef the double sail from the cockpit. So I wouldn't even have to, do anything particular if I wanted to reef. And it was really, really fast. And on top of it, they were Yankee sails, so they had very high cut clews. So the poles would never touch the water, even if the boat was rolling, because that's the only problem if you're sailing like that without a main, is the boat rolls quite a lot.
Yeah. So,
yeah. But then I'd also sometimes just pole the weather wing out, and I'd have the mainsail up as well. And that was also kind of a nice fast sail combination. It was a good intermediate between sort of, it's just too breezy for the spinnaker, but it's just not breezy enough to do away with more sail area. So that worked quite
well. Right. Okay. Because when I saw that whole setup, I was like, man, that looks like such a great idea. But I wasn't sure how you furled it or how that all worked, or if it was 2 of them, like sort of going in different slots in the foil, or what. Because I've often all the stuff on my boat's all Hank on, but I have these big drifters, and I've never had it in a situation where it's just perfect enough to try and interweave the Hanks going up and have 2 big drifters out. I don't have 2 spinnaker poles either, but there's been a few situations where you're in like 4 knots of breeze, perfectly flat, no swell at all, and you can sort of mess around with these oddball sail configurations. Like I've had a jib and then a staysail pulled out opposite, and then the full mainsail, and you're kind of I don't know, having fun with it, I guess. But
that is kind of the fun part for me, is when you can get creative, because initially when I had this double sail, the idea wasn't to sail with only one wing poled out in the main and all that. That was just experimenting again on a moment when the wind was perfect and you're getting bored and you just want to try out something new. So that was very cool. The only thing is, it's a lot of fumbling around up on the foredeck with poles, because every time you want to get it down, you got to get your poles down again. And fortunately, I had this premonition somewhere, like on my way from South Africa up to Europe. I was now practicing with this new sail, and I thought I better take just a single Yankee as well, because I didn't know why. I just thought maybe at some point I wouldn't want the double sail anymore. It was mainly because the fumbling around with the poles was irritating me. But then what happened to me is I broke one of my poles in the Southern Pacific. And then I couldn't use that sail anymore, because you can't then just pole it out as a single sail, because it still wants to fill. So I then was very glad that I had the single, because with one pole broken, I actually had to drop that whole thing and just put the single up onto the foil. So, I guess everything's a bit of a compromise at the end of the day, but for what it was, it worked really well.
No, 100%. Well, and it's funny that you talk about the whole idea of like sort of fumbling around up on the foredeck. That was what kind of prevented me, I think, early on from really utilizing a pulled out staysail or a pulled out jib. Because I was like, man, if it starts cranking up, I don't want to be up there and have to deal with the sail and this pole and the boat's rolling and all sort of stuff. So I kind of shied away from it. But that actually led me to realize that on the West Sail, you can get away with just having, the mainsail up, either deeply reefed or all the way up, but without a jib, because the mast is so far forward and that big long keel, it just tracks and it surfs and it just keeps going. It doesn't round up like a modern boat would. That was kind of a nice discovery, especially, that I was in the Southern Ocean with the Westerlies. But it also led me to try and really dissect how I could make it safer to utilize the pole and balance the rig by having, like, say, the staysail and a double reef in the main. And, I, not to get all into the technicals of it now, but because that challenge was sort of presented and I wanted to beat it down and figure out a way, through all the experimentation and playing, as you say, with these different sail combinations, I came up with a way where I can get everything set on the staysail, the pole's all there, everything's good, and just go back to the cockpit, and all I have to do is hoist the halyard, and it's up, and it's perfect. And if I want to douse it, I just let go of the halyard, everything falls, and then I can go deal with it. And yeah, I mean, like I said, that experimentation is I think crucial to sort of innovating, but also just becoming like a better sailor. Because I know by the time I got back, I was definitely a better sailor than when I started. Would you think you were as well?
Definitely.
I think it's pretty obvious.
Well, yeah, and it's the fun part, because it's the part where you get to be creative, instead of doing it like this is how they teach you to do it and this is how everyone else does it. You say, well, but I'm the one out here now dealing with the problem, and I want to make it easier for myself, or I want to make it more effective or efficient or whatever else, and it actually becomes fun. So yeah.
And that's the big point of all of it, right? Is to enjoy the experience and have fun. I mean, I guess to sort of end things off, for me, one of the biggest things that I learned, and I'll probably ask you the exact same question. What was the biggest thing you learned? Was sort of the beautiful balance between suffering and joy, and how joy is great, but it's not something that if it's just all joy, it becomes monotonous. It becomes normal. When you have that suffering aspect, as we always do when we're out there on the ocean, then all of a sudden the joy gets amplified more and more, sort of depending on the scale of suffering that you've had to go through, i.e., 4.5 months in the Southern Ocean to then finally get to your beautiful southeast trade winds in the South Atlantic going north. One of the probably top 5 moments in my entire life. Like, I had 3 days of perfect weather for the first time, in months, and there was no fear and all that sort of stuff. And I think that was one of the things that I took back to land with me, was that, yeah, okay, well, this situation kind of sucks, but if I think about it, that means that when it's not like this anymore, it's going to be really, really great. And so it's actually worth it. So I might as well embrace this discomfort, this suffering, this thing I don't want to do. And that was something that I don't think I would have learned to the extent that I did unless I did that big trip around the world. Are there any, and I know I'm putting you on the spot, but was there any like real key takeaways that the ocean taught you?
Well,
I know it's a tough one.
It is a tough one. It's key takeaways. Well, it's interesting. I mean, I don't want to now sort of copy what you've just said, but just briefly to what you said about the balance between enjoying yourself and suffering. Guy de Boer, the American competitor, he actually said to me before the race, it's got to be grueling. You've got to suffer, because if you don't suffer, you can't win. But I thought, yeah, maybe if you're doing a 4-day race, you can suffer through 4 consecutive days or a week or whatever, or maybe 2, but not if you're doing 8 or 9 or more months. You have to be able to enjoy yourself. And I guess in my moments when I was, let's say, suffering or I was unhappy, one thing I always reminded myself of is actually if you look around, it's still really beautiful. So if you're in a storm, just to be surrounded by those elements, the force of the elements, and there's phosphorescence and there's all sorts of stuff, it's really, really amazing. And in the same way, you're stuck in the doldrums and there's all this beauty around you. And then I said to myself, well, it was a choice. I chose to be here. And one of the main reasons I chose to be there was because I want to experience the nature.
Yeah.
So in the bad moments, I just said, look, forget it. Forget what's irritating you and look at what's around you, because that's one of the principal reasons for going out, is to experience the sea and the ocean and the nature and the birds and the wildlife. And that's one thing that always brought me cheer again, was wildlife. If I saw wildlife, whether it was krill or an albatross or a whale, it just made me happy.
Yeah, no, they are. It is so amazing when you go from a stretch of, maybe weeks and you barely see anything. There's typically always birds, I suppose, but then all of a sudden you pass over some plateau or shallow area or an upwelling in the current, and there's just life everywhere. The dolphins and the whales, and it is just an amazing, amazing place. And it makes me want to go out sailing.
Yeah, me too. And the other thing about the birds is sometimes you're in a real storm, like, I don't know, and it's really uncomfortable for you, and you're nervous and you're worried, and is something going to break, and am I going to survive this? And then there's an albatross gliding there in the 50 to 60 knots, as though it's the most normal thing. And then you suddenly realize what a little sort of tiny little drop in the ocean you are, that doesn't even belong there, because it's not your element, but that there are creatures out there that just positively thrive on it. So that to me is always a consolation in some way.
Well, and that, they were kind of my cue as well, because when the birds disappeared, that's when I knew. I was like, uh-oh, this could be a really ugly gale that's coming in. I'm pretty sure, because I went through a gale in March that actually took the life of one of the Volvo ocean race sailors, John Fisher, and we were all kind of in the storm. They were further south than I was, but I do remember as that one was building, the birds disappeared, and I was kind of like, that's concerning, because normally they do. Normally they ride that stuff out pretty easy, but anyway, well, Kirsten, I can't thank you enough for coming on and chatting with me. Hopefully, because I don't think we got to like half of what I wrote down. I would love to be able to follow this up at some point. I'm headed out to sea for a couple of coaching trips coming up, but I'll be back on land this summer, and maybe I'll hit you back up again.
Okay, do that. Well, it's been fun chatting, Jerome. I've enjoyed listening to your experiences. So I'd definitely be keen on another follow-up chat with you, so I can pick your brain as well.
Just a couple of solo round the world sailors here, Oh, wait. Okay. Sorry. Last question. And this is the one that I always hate, but I always get asked. What's next? What any big plans?
I don't have any major exciting sort of adventures planned, which is usually what people expect me to say. So I'm just kind of like enjoying just being normal and doing normal stuff again. But I'm still doing delivery trips, and I've got a really cool delivery trip planned next year through the Northwest Passage. So I'm looking forward to that, because I'm kind of missing the high latitudes. So yeah.
Wow, very cool. If they get an open crew spot on that, keep me in mind.
Okay, definitely will. You never know, it might happen.
Yeah, seriously. I tried to go up there in 2020 and made it to the Labrador Sea when they closed the passage down and turned me around.
Because of COVID.
That was a bit of a yeah.
Oh,
so
wow.
That happens. It's in the past. No big deal.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Kirsten. Really, really appreciate it. Good luck with everything going forward. And we'll talk again soon.
Cool, Jerome. Good luck to you, and thanks a lot.
Thank you.